Hey guys, welcome back to the Through Their Eyes podcast. This is season 4, episode 4, and we're continuing our study on the minister files. We've been talking a lot this season about the idea of going to a filing cabinet and pulling out a file and wanting to read what it has in there to learn more. Rather than doing it that way for this, we just thought we'd pull a preacher out of a lineup and have him come and sit with us and tell us about the specific subjects we're talking about. As always, I'm your host, Michael Clark, the Director of Operations at Scattered Abroad. I have with me to my right, your left, not that it matters, but it's Wayne Rogers, Director of Programming at Scattered Abroad. And today we're talking about balancing a study life. And as we've said on a few different episodes and some that you'll even see yet future, when we came up with this lineup and came up with these topics, there are several of these episodes where it did not take long to think about who we wanted to speak to and who we wanted to interview and have a roundtable discussion with. And this individual is no different. I always gain something from his preaching. I look forward on polishing the pulpit and other lectureships when he is preaching. I try to take as much notes as possible. He has made things come alive in a way that is just so impressive to me, which tells you that he studies. Nobody can just think all of this on the fly. It takes a lot of intense effort and study. So we're happy to welcome to the program Cliff Goodwin. Cliff, welcome in.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead and tell us who you are, what you do, all that good stuff.
Okay. I'm Cliff Goodwin. I have been preaching for the last 27 plus years for the Ironaton congregation. We're located just outside of Talladega, Alabama. And I moved there single. Met my wife there, married one of the members, and it turns out when you marry one of the members, you cannot leave. And so I've learned that, and that's been a great blessing, been able to raise my 3 kids at the same location. That's really what I was looking for, and very thankful that we've been able to do that.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons we selected you was, like we mentioned on another episode that is either aired or is going to yet air with Chad Dollahite, you don't stay in one location for 27, almost 28 years without doing a great job in the pulpit as well as in the community. And if the preacher gets up every single Sunday and he preaches most every Sunday with maybe 5 to 8 weeks of the year where he's not in that area preaching, most of those preachers though will preach an average of 100 plus sermons and 52 to 100 plus Bible classes and all of those kinds of things. And after a while, you have covered some of the very same principles. You've covered some of the very same books and verses and chapters and other things. Even if you're preaching a completely different subject, you might be bringing out a similar text. And I know that in the 5 years I was in local work with one congregation, I always stressed over, are they going to feel like they've heard this before or whatever? And I hear sometimes about preachers who don't put in that study, and it is shown and it is known. And so you don't stay somewhere 27 and a half years if you have not been very studious in what you do. And so I'm thankful to have you here, but this is what we want to talk about with balancing the study life. Can the preacher study too much or not enough? And if so, how does that balance need a shift?
Okay. And you know, some of the things you just mentioned, I want to drive a brief peg, if I may. That's really pertaining to the subject of preacher longevity at a location. And if maybe toward the end, if we have some time, I would like to share some things about that.
Sure.
I know that's a little bit off topic for now, but we'll remember that. And if we have time, we'll talk about longevity. Can a preacher study too much? You know, when you first posed that question to me, that was really intriguing because your knee-jerk reaction is, well, of course not. Mm-hmm. You know, a preacher cannot study the Word of God too much, you would think. And in one sense, that's true. But of course, what we're driving at and what needs to be appreciated is only if a preacher can study too much, only if he studies to the neglect and to the detriment of other duties and responsibilities. So that's the way I would answer that.
Yeah.
What we need far more of, I feel, throughout the Lord's church and throughout the world is we need men stepping into the pulpit who are well studied and who are well prepared. We need more of that, absolutely. But the extreme is, and we've probably all known of some instances maybe that we could think about, but the extreme is when a man stays, quote, holed up with his books, to the point that he neglects his family, which I know is another podcast. We don't have to dwell on that for this one, or to the neglect of some of his other ministerial duties, well, then there's a problem. And it's really unexpected. You wouldn't think about it that way, but that is something to be aware of.
Absolutely. Now, what about the people that they go the other route and they don't study at all? How do we find that to be a detriment, a problem? Is it something that is known very quickly in the congregation, or how is that snuffed out, if you will, and sniffed out?
I don't know. Now, that latter portion of the question may be more difficult. Obviously, when you're dealing with any local circumstance, then the ruling, overseeing body lies with the eldership. And so any addressing and addressing and correcting of those problems ultimately is going to be in their court, the eldership's court. I will say this, from time to time, in visiting or preaching other places, you almost get a sense maybe that perhaps the local preacher maybe majors more on the visitation side than he does on the studying side. Now, I want you to know that before I would draw any hard and fast conclusions, I would be very careful about that. I'm just talking about impressions, and we all know impressions can be wrong. But the benefit of visitation is typically the more that a preacher is out among the members of the congregation, and for that matter, among people in the community, generally, the more that happens, the more liked the preacher is, well beloved generally. And that's good. That's a good thing. The problem is, just like we addressed it a moment ago, or we stated it a moment ago, you can study to the neglect of visitation, but you can also visit to the neglect of studying. And in that latter regard, which we're presently on, over time, you'll have a congregation, I describe them as being that deep in the scriptures. In other words, the knowledge base throughout the membership soon becomes lacking. And that's never good. That's never good because, well, for a number of reasons, but of course we're familiar with Hosea 4:6, where the prophet said, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." When it comes to being deficient, we never want to be deficient or shallow in our biblical understanding. That's not healthy for the congregation. It's not good for the community that the congregation is hopefully serving. An added thing, and I'll leave it at this: if and when that present preacher leaves, if his tenure there had been a protracted tenure of several years, and yet his studying had been shallow, and therefore increasingly his preaching over time became shallow, he's just made the job for the next preacher coming in much more difficult.
No doubt.
They're going to likely not find deep, meaty, and sometimes even difficult or challenging gospel preaching. They're not going to find it as palatable as faithful congregations should. Yeah. And that's problematic.
Yeah, and I think you can see probably in our brotherhood the decline of congregations going, that if you were able to investigate it out, you would find that certainly has been a part of that. The responsibility to make sure that's not happening obviously lies within the eldership of those congregations. And then to start thinking about, okay, well, that the preacher, and his responsibility, his role to preach, and to, we talk about this as preachers, you've got to make sure that there's enough milk in there so that those who are on milk can take that in and get, so you can't, feed them full meat the whole sermon. Maybe you try to bring in some of all of that, so there's a balance within the sermon itself. We talk about, but at the same time, there has to be enough preaching to cause people to grow and to ask questions and to challenge where their faith is, and we talk about, kind of the level of faith, and that based on how much knowledge of the Word of God they have, and so how practical that is in their lives, obviously. So if it is shallow, and that's certainly the problem that we find, and then we start seeing shallow congregations, and we see them, Paul talks about that drifting this way or drifting this way, and so that's certainly that's problematic. What would be a wise biblical approach, if you will, for the preacher to have a balanced study life? How would you, if you were advising someone, maybe a younger preacher starting out, how would you advise him to start? And then maybe even someone who's just to think about it from two standpoints, from a younger preacher getting started, and maybe somebody that you're still maybe mentoring or helping, or you're a friend of that maybe has been preaching maybe a decade. And how would they, because I can think back in almost 30 years of preaching that I went through phases, where I, in my study life, I was, maybe not studying as I once was in a certain way, or, maybe I was off studying other things that weren't really relevant to what I was actually needing to be even preaching sometimes. And so kind of majoring in the minors, so to speak, in those kind of things. And so what advice would you give, or how would you kind of approach that biblically?
Well, I mean, there's a whole lot to say regarding that, obviously. And some of my experiences and therefore some of my perspectives might not be as beneficial to others as some might be. But I would offer this. We're familiar with 1 Timothy 4:16. We know that as gospel preachers, our fundamental duty is twofold, and that is to take heed, therefore, unto ourselves and unto our teaching. The word doctrine means teaching. And so a biblical approach, a practical method for a biblical viewpoint on this, we know that Brother Bland in preaching school, he used to tell us, he said, boys, Sunday comes every week. Okay, so we know that. And we know that in the life of the local church, and I don't mean any harm by expressing it this way, but in the life of the local church, we know that Sunday's the big day. Mm-hmm. It's the day when you're likely going to have your most visitors, which visitors are a lifeline to the growth of a church in so many ways. It's a time when you get everybody together, hopefully. In theory, you get everybody together. And work schedules and so many things just all contribute to the fact that the Lord's Day, understandably, is the big day in the life of a local church. Now, as a gospel preacher, that comes every week. And so I would say that taking heed unto the doctrine, taking heed unto your teaching, that has got to begin very early in the week. Yeah. You preach, you teach 2 or 3 times. Many of us teach or preach 3 times on Sunday. Mm-hmm. Really and truly, ideally, when Monday rolls around, it's time to already be preparing for the next Sunday. Some people sometimes lay out, I think, where on Monday they begin maybe focusing on the Sunday morning sermon for the next week. Tuesday, they begin preparing Wednesday night Bible class or going over it. And of course, I'm speaking hypothetically, mm-hmm. but you know that if you're responsible for 2 sermons and 2 Bible classes, you're responsible for 4 lessons per week in the local church. Well, I'm here to tell you there's only 5 days in the work week, mm-hmm. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, yep. Thursday, and Friday. And if you don't think that you could easily devote a day's worth of work to 1 lesson, then that's a whole other matter we probably need to discuss. And so I would think of it from the standpoint of trying to divvy up my week, maybe having a certain day for a certain responsibility, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, whatever. Make sure you're prepared. But then also, as far as visiting and things like that, you need to have some time set aside for that as well. And we might say more about that later on as we move along if you want to.
Well, it is interesting. I know we're in a New Testament age and needing to follow the New Testament primarily as our law that we're under. But I remember in preaching school for me, and I don't know if Dad would have said this to you, when you were there. I know Dad wouldn't have said it to you when you were there. He wasn't there yet. But Dad told us in school one time, if you remember nothing else about the Old Testament, don't overlook and forget and neglect Deuteronomy 28, because that chapter is the basis. If you remove Deuteronomy 28 from that book, a majority of the Old Testament is not needed, because all of the captivity, all of the prophets and other things that are happening because of the captivity and all of that stuff surrounding that wouldn't have happened if Deuteronomy 28 was not written and warned that this is what will be the case if you don't do what is right. And in 68 verses, there's 14 that are good about all the blessings that come, and then 15 through 68, over 120 plus punishments and curses and things that will be brought upon people. It's horrible to read, especially knowing, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, and knowing that they actually didn't do the first 14, they did the latter part. But I would add to that too, the same thing that I remember hearing Dad talk about in school, which is if people would follow Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 28 wouldn't have been difficult to follow and wouldn't have been difficult to do. And they were specifically commanded, and this wasn't written to Moses as the prophet or their modern day preacher. It wasn't written to the leadership. It was written to all of them, to keep the commandments of the Lord and to bind them in the front of their eyes as frontlets and to bind them onto their wrists and to be able to always look around and see the law, which is something that intentionally is talked about as study it, know it, learn it, live it. And that's something that a wise biblical approach, it's interesting to look at. Those 2 chapters in the Old Testament are so pivotal to everything that happens after that. And if it were not for Deuteronomy 28, we wouldn't have the book of Daniel. We wouldn't have everything that happens there. We wouldn't have some of the prophecies and what happens with Jeremiah going through and telling the people, no, it's going to be bad. Oh, it won't be so bad. No, it's going to be bad, I'm telling you. And you look at all of that, and I think it's amazing that with the preacher, though that is who we're talking about, I think it's important, a balanced biblical approach and a studious life is also encouraging the members to do the best they can to study as well, because this is what was the command then. And from that point forward, because the children of Israel just didn't care, didn't want to do it, and sometimes didn't even have leaders that encouraged them to do it. Because of that, like you mentioned a moment ago, if a preacher spends all of his time visiting, not enough time studying and preaching, that will make the next job very difficult for the other preacher that's coming in and following him. The same is true when a congregation is not encouraged to be, studious in their own lives. And I think it's impressive. I know you probably heard this, but I remember hearing in preaching school, whatever version of the Bible you use, primarily the congregation will go out and buy, because they'll want to know this is what our preacher's about to read, and they'll want to follow along with that. A lot of people are that way where they don't like the differences. They want it to match. Right. And I saw that happen when I went to where I was working in Somerville. Some people came up to me and said, what version do you use? And then next week they come, look at my new Bible. And it's that version that I was using. Wow. And it made life a lot easier for them. I think if they see the preacher as one who balances it properly, they know that he's trying to do his best in the community, but they also see there might be a time on a Thursday night at 9:00, they drive by the building, his car's still there. And he's up there studying because he's been in the hospital all day with the person that was having a procedure and sitting with the family. When they see that, I think it's kind of that leading by example and knowing that balanced approach. If I don't have it, then I don't think the members are going to see it either and have it for themselves. And the peril of preaching is not just that Sunday comes once a week, though that's certainly the very top of the list. The peril of preaching is I'm supposed to help encourage people to be more like Christ by 1 Corinthians 11:1 and imitation, being more like the Savior. If I'm not doing that, they're certainly not going to be able to see a good example of how to do that. But if I do that and they see that and we encourage things to try to do more study and more opportunities to grow, I think that's just for the benefit of the congregation.
If I may, Michael, I'd like to say something tying in with what you just offered. And this is really, we could talk a lot about studying, and studying is paramount. It's very important. Just because the local leadership has hired you, and just because you now fill the role of the local preacher, that alone does not guarantee that the people sitting in the pews are going to listen to you.
Right.
Okay. Now, They may be there faithfully. They may be there, but there's something that we'll call relational capital. Relational capital. And through your visitation, you're building that as the local preacher. I found it interesting. You mentioned the example of maybe being at a hospital all day while someone had surgery. Well, there are some things about that you cannot replace with anything else. Mm-hmm. And I call it, or we're calling it today, relational capital. Whenever, and it begins with your members. I want to say this. Anything affecting the members of the local church, if at all possible, you need to be there. If you can't be there, you need to call. If you can't call, you need to text. If you can't call or text or be there, when you get back in pocket, you need to check on them. That goes without saying. But some of the best prospects for congregational growth lie with the family, the extended family of your own members. And so over time, as you learn your members and you're learning about their lives and you're learning about their extended family, well, then that circle widens. Mm-hmm. And sure, so-and-so's not a member, but this is one of our members' aunts, and she's having surgery today, and this will give me an opportunity to meet her children, and it's just a domino effect. Mm-hmm. But when you get up in the pulpit on Sunday morning and you open the Word of God and you begin preaching, if you have built relational capital with the people sitting in the pew, they're going to listen. Mm-hmm. They're going to listen. And I don't know that I want to say you've earned that, but I will say that you've put the work in to help build that and establish that. And it just put legs on your preaching. That's Absolutely. All it does. It puts legs on your preaching.
And we certainly can't expect a book as thick as this, and this is just the New Testament, Psalms and Proverbs, could be covered without intense diving into it. Mm-hmm. However, when I dive into it, I'm going to read about Jesus, who was so compassionate and cared about the people. And I see that balance of the relational capital that you're talking about, where even, I mentioned this on another episode, but it's so applicable. Mm-hmm. In Luke 17, when those lepers saw him from afar off and said, "That's Jesus." Mm-hmm. How would you know who that is? Because there's no social media posting pictures of him. They didn't have the ability to whip out a phone book and say, "Yeah, that's his photo right there." They knew who he was by his reputation and by who was following him and who was with him. They knew that because of his compassion. And that's why they cried out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." They knew, you can fix us. You can save us. And I think, as we know, we're not miraculous. We don't have the ability to fix the infirmities that people have, but there is something to be said, about that preacher when he walks in to that moment of deep trouble for that family, and he's able to sit with the family. And I remember one time we had a member who was on death's door. It was close. He would die a couple days later. And myself and the other minister, we went to the hospital, and we didn't know he was in the hospital till we'd already gotten to the office. Well, we threw our computer bags in the car, and we just left immediately for the hospital, thinking we were just going to be sitting with the family all day. We walked in, and the family was very happy to see us. And after about 30 minutes of visiting and doing all that, they said, "Well, y'all go back and study." And we said, "Well, we'd like to sit with you." And they said, "Well, do you have your computers?" And we said, we do. And they said, "Well, then you go get them." And here we are sitting in this hospital in the family room, typing and studying on our sermons. And then we're having a Bible study even with them, talking about what we're studying, talking about what's coming up. And I still have a deep relationship with this family, but it got deeper that day. Yeah. Even though it was building because of the type. But that relational capital is very important. And if we miss it, it's a huge problem. And this is exactly where we kind of bring this to a crescendo. And then I want to have you talk about what you mentioned when you're done answering this. You jump just right into what you talked about preacher longevity. Okay. What happens to congregations that have visitations more than preaching and pulpiteers more than visitations? And if you don't know what a pulpiteer is, those of you that are watching or listening, we simply just mean somebody who's really known for being in the pulpit and being in the office studying, preaching all the time. What happens in those two scenarios? Well,
I think I realize now that I might have gotten the cart a little before the horse a moment ago when we were talking about this. But just to briefly review that, When you have a congregation where the preacher majors in visiting to the neglect of his studies and preparation for the pulpit, then you tend to have shallow congregations. Shallow in the sense of not having a good grasp of God's word and not having a deep working knowledge thereof. On the other hand, you can have pulpiteers who study endless hours through the week, but they in their lives are detached from the lives of the members. And the problem that potentially lies with that is, a man can get up and he can deliver a masterful sermon on Sunday, but if it falls on deaf ears, then to what avail? What good has this done? You've got to have, to an extent, that relational capital. I think, now this is my opinion, I think you've got to have that relational capital so that all of the effort and all of the hard work that you put into your sermon, so that someone will actually listen to you.
Yeah.
I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about everything going on with longevity and all of that, if you had to give just a couple of tips to somebody on how they can stay by currying favor beyond just relational capital and being a good preacher, what are some tips and tricks you might give to somebody that's saying, I want to be at this local work till I'm not local working anymore?
I got you. Let me build up to that by revisiting two things real quickly. I'd like to share just some practical thoughts on both the visitation side and on the study side. Okay. To all preachers, especially younger preachers, when it comes to study, think quality over quantity. Quality over quantity. Now, one of the major factors into that is all of us as people, we generally have a time period of the day in which our minds are freshest and our minds are more able to process and deliberate and ponder. And that's absolutely necessary in Bible study. You've got to be able to ponder. Okay. For me, for example, it's morning hours, not necessarily early morning, but as early as I comfortably awake and arise, those first 3 to 4 hours are fantastic. Mm-hmm. I hear that for some, it's late night hours, but try to build your study schedule and your study regimen week after week, day after day. Think quality over quantity. Now, your local elders may disagree, and so you've got to make this jive with your leadership. I appreciate that. But I'm telling you, a man that can put in 2 great hours of studying in the morning, then that's probably more profitable than his deliberately, purposefully staying in the office in the afternoon from 1 to 5 when he's already had lunch. The blood flows to his stomach, not to his brain. And he'd probably be better served out visiting or doing something else.
Right.
So think quality over quantity. Number 2, when it comes to that, good resources is vital. Okay. Good resources is vital. I have a limited number of resources that do not stay in my office. And that's because they stay at my home. Mm-hmm. Now, I've got an office. I'm very blessed. I have an office full of books. I have a nice enough library, thankfully. But I have a limited number that don't go to the office. They stay with me. That way I can access them when I want them. And you need to identify those. That they may be different for various preachers. I'll share with you basically what I have. And this is with the disclosure that anytime I mention a denominational author or a denominational source, I'm wanting you to understand that you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. I think that goes without saying. But I will hardly prepare any lesson from a topic or text in the New Testament without consulting Linsky, his set of commentaries. That set stays at my house. Wiersbe, Biblical Exposition Commentary, those 6 volumes, they stay at my house. Practically anything written by the late Brother Wayne Jackson it doesn't stay at my office, it stays at my house. And then certain other books that maybe address either a corpus of Scripture or certain books in Scripture. For example, the late Brother Wood's commentaries on John and James, and 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, it stays in my house. The Wood's questions and answers stays in my house. R.C. Foster's book on the life of Christ, it will stay in my house. I don't have to have a lot of sources for my studies. I have to have good sources. Mm-hmm. And that streamlines my studies, okay? And that's more toward quality over quantity. Now, that's some practical things on studying. Real quickly, the practical side of visitation. If you can find one of your elders and you and he set aside one night a week that you and he can go visiting. When I was a younger preacher, I had that. And I'm going to tell you what, that benefited me in ways hard to describe. Mm-hmm. Someone says, well, we don't have elders. Find a faithful leading man in the congregation. If you do have elders, but maybe you relate better to one of the deacons, just find a buddy. Mm-hmm. Find somebody that y'all can typically have a set night. Tuesday nights is what it has been in times past for me. And that way, that ensures a couple of things. Number one, it allows you to make some visits that you really probably don't need to make alone, but you can make with another man alongside you. Number two, knowing that somebody is counting on you and is looking forward to Tuesday night is going to keep you motivated and make you less apt to back out, yep. Or to get busy at 3:00 in the afternoon. Oh, I was going to visit tonight, but I've got this going on. If you've got somebody waiting on you, you're less likely to do that. Accountability. Yeah. It helps so much. And then number three, if it's the right person, if it's somebody with whom you relate well and somebody who gets you and you get them as your partner, then you're going to keep each other encouraged. Even on the difficult visits, even on visits that maybe didn't turn out the way you had hoped, you're going to be encouraged. And so that's something practical regarding the study side, something practical regarding the visitation side. I don't know if we have time for me to say anything about longevity. We absolutely
do.
Go ahead.
Okay, how can we not give you time for longevity?
Okay. The key to this, and if it's ever my case at Ironaton, I bring this out first and foremost. A major key to my longevity at Ironaton has been our elders. Okay. If you do not have good, faithful leadership, then I don't know how long a man's going to want to stay and fill that pulpit, sadly. And then B, even if he has the desire to stay and to try to make it better, he may not be given the opportunity, because poor leadership doesn't appreciate good preaching and good work. And sometimes that's the problem. And so I'm very thankful before God. I'm very thankful for the elders that I've always had over 27 years. I have never, in 27 years, I can never recall a time when I was forbidden, when I was prohibited from preaching or teaching any biblical subject. My hands have never been tied. Now, a lot of preachers cannot say that. And they cannot say that, sadly, maybe even about some of the places they are currently. Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't make for a good work environment if that's happening. I've always been unfettered in my ability to preach the truth on any topic. And not only unfettered, but I've always been encouraged to do that. So, number one, good local elders. Number two, it takes a special congregation of people. It takes a special congregation of people sometimes for a man to be able to stay 2 or 3 or 4 decades. And I believe we have a really special group of people. And so that's two of the things. Now, number three, we'll get off of trying to put credit where credit goes legitimately. But in the third place, a lot of it's going to depend on you as the preacher. And if you want longevity, if you want to stay where you are, you've got to keep studying. You've got to stay fresh. Now, The whole tenor of this is not to the neglect of your visitation, obviously, But man, you have got to stay fresh. And I tell you what I do, and our members at Ironaton, they never know what to expect on Sunday morning or Wednesday night because I might not have used PowerPoint the last 8 months. And then I'll come in and for 6 weeks in a row, we may use PowerPoint. I may go a couple of years without fill in the blank sheets.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the gimmick, but that's the tool that I'm on right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is Bible classes, and sometimes even my sermons may have fill in the blank handouts.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll preach with neither PowerPoint nor handouts. You've got to stay fresh in your studies, but I think it's also beneficial to stay fresh in your methodologies and in your approaches. And I think that's very, very important. And also, too, if you want to stay somewhere, you had better let the people know, and I'll close with this. But if you want to stay somewhere, you had better let your brothers and sisters know that you love them and that you care about them and that you're happy to be there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're one of these that's prone to complaints and murmuring and, you know, this is wrong and this is bad, and if that's what your members are hearing, then, you know, if it ever was brought to their attention, you would really like to stay here 20 years, they'd be like, well, that's news to me. I can't tell that. And so you need to communicate not a disgruntled spirit, but love and contentment and satisfaction, and just keep trying to do the work. Just keep trying to do the work. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wayne, you got anything you want to add to that?
100% agree, and thankful that you brought that out. I know that's going to help a lot of folks as they think about the life of a preacher, and hopefully folks that are maybe not preaching that will listen to this, that'll understand from the preacher's perspective as well the work that we're trying to accomplish.
Right.
You know, and so I think educating congregations on the work of preaching, you know, which is hard for the preacher to do. So it's kind of a weird thing, but I think that's helpful as well too. So appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. You had to be here, so you know, we're glad that you're here, though. Thank you for watching or listening. We're grateful that you've taken some time to join us in the Minister Files here on Through Their Eyes. We'll be back with Cliff, Lord willing, this Thursday, and have an episode that's a little bit more laid back, just swap some stories. He keeps telling us he doesn't have any stories, but I think we'll get some out of him. So come back Thursday and see what we can muster up. Until then, don't forget, you can find all of our information, including the information to Ironaton and other places that Cliff will give us if you're ever passing through the area. I know they'd love to have you. We'll have all of that in the show notes and in the description of this video, including our email, san@msop.org. We're thankful so much to the Memphis School of Preaching for allowing us to be one of their works. We're also thankful in this particular season to be at the House to House studios and grateful that they've opened their doors to us. They have a lot of great content as well and a lot of great things. We'll put their information in the show notes as well. As always, what we're trying to do is learn more about how we can be a better picture of Jesus Christ. That's the whole purpose of life, is imitating the Son. And if we can do that and see through the eyes of the writers of the Bible, see what they were thinking when the Spirit was inspiring them, to see what Jesus was saying through his lens, then we'll have a much better life ahead. Until next time, take care and God bless.